Shekar, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, listen, many people know you in the Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Corona area. You're running for Council District 25. But can you tell those that don't know you that well, or a little bit about yourself and what your platform is?
Sure. My name is Shekar Krishnan. I'm a Democrat running for City Council to represent Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, Queens, my home. And I'm running because I feel at this point, we all know it well, that New York City is absolutely in crisis right now. And we really need to restructure our city in radical and fundamental ways and rebuild it so it's a city that really works for everyone. We, as Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, were the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. And that wasn't any kind of coincidence or accident. It was the result of decades of disinvestment in our neighborhoods by city government. And it was our essential workers, our immigrant communities who were our essential workers, who were standing in long lines at Elmhurst Hospital without health insurance to get tested in the middle of the pandemic, a public safety net hospital that was receiving far less in public resources than other institutions around the city. And these are our immigrant communities, are our essential workers, and the ones who, as many tenants, are living in overcrowded housing because housing has become so unaffordable. So for me, as I'm a father of two small children, I'm a community activist of a long time in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. And I'm also a lawyer for low-income tenants in some of the poorest and most vulnerable neighborhoods in the city, fighting for housing as a human right, fighting for housing justice. I've seen the ways firsthand in which landlords have taken sledgehammers to their buildings to destroy them, to force tenants out overnight because of rising rents, gentrification, and displacement. And these are all fights that intersect so much with housing, and I've fought both through my work and in my community as well. And these are now the fights that are front and center when we think about the ways that we need to dismantle these systems of oppression and systemic injustice and rebuild New York City. And we have the choice now to either take that head on or continue with reformist incremental changes around the edges of a fundamentally failed system that just isn't serving the most vulnerable New Yorkers.
All right. Now, on a local level too, you played a big role in founding, the whole Diversity Plaza, the Friends of group, and, I guess making that almost like well known throughout the city in many respects. Can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of other community things that you're tied in with?
Sure, both as a community activist, as a housing advocate, as a public school parent, I've been involved in so many different issues in our community over the years, fighting alongside my neighbors on so many fundamental issues that are affecting us, whether it is safe streets for our children and seniors. You look at Northern Boulevard and how dangerous it is, whether it's fighting for housing rights for our immigrant tenants and so many others who are facing harassment from their landlords, whether it's public space like Diversity Plaza or Traverse Park. With Diversity Plaza, I was one of the co-founders and leaders of Friends of Diversity Plaza. When Diversity Plaza first started out in our neighborhood, it wasn't receiving any attention at all or any resources from city government. And so much of our work was really advocating to ensure that the city was actually, for an immigrant community like ours, actually paying attention to such a special public place and public space. And it's been incredible to see, because everyone in our community who uses Diversity Plaza, and frankly across Queens, both frequenting the plaza or having events at the plaza, it's really become the town square of Jackson Heights and a protest space, a space for mourning that has really defined our neighborhood, but also Queens as well. And the same way, when it comes to Traverse Park, we've done a lot of organizing over the years to ensure the park is the green space that it is today. Jackson Heights and Elmhurst are two of the neighborhoods that rank among the lowest in New York City when it comes to open park space. And that was hugely important during this pandemic as well, when social distancing and isolation required finding space also outside too. But Traverse Park, like Diversity Plaza, was an essential way to protect and expand open space in our neighborhood. And one of the fights we face now, frankly, is the way in which the Capel car dealership on Northern Boulevard has infringed that park space, a struggle that I've been intimately involved with as well. So whether it's, fighting for resources for our public schools, on housing rights or open space, these are all fights for years that I've joined with my neighbors to ensure that our communities both receive the resources that we deserve and that our rights are also protected and our voices are heard by city government.
Right. Yeah, I'm very familiar with you in terms of your involvement with the Capel site on the Northern Boulevard, the access to Travers Park, and I mean, what can be done in terms of more park space in Jackson Heights, as you mentioned? I mean, it is, it's got a gigantic lack of green space. Is there anything that can be done to increase it, perhaps?
Absolutely. Well, I think three things immediately come to mind that I think are critical as part of doing the work and in the community and in government as well. One is, as you just alluded to, we absolutely have to protect and expand the park space that we have. So the notion that a car dealership like Capel would be intruding on park space that was promised to us is a larger fight than just that space itself. It actually goes to show the way in which city government has, over all of this time, really treated parks and public space so differently depending on the neighborhood you're in, whether it's our neighborhoods with Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, versus other wealthier neighborhoods in the city that receive far more resources. The first step is really to protect the space that we have and expand it like Travers. The second thing is space is also 34th Avenue, which has become really such an important and cherished space for our neighborhoods, really connecting so many blocks and communities together. That needs to be made permanent. It needs to be expanded. And when we do that, and we're proud to see that because of the advocacy of so many in our community, we have actually an opportunity now to do that and make it permanent. We need to ensure and hold DOT accountable to making sure that's the case. But when we have 34th Avenue as a permanent space, we could actually completely rethink and re-envision how a street like that, that's now an open street, can be used for our community to generate more green and open space too. And I think, frankly, 34th Avenue should really be a model for open streets in New York City. It's been so successful and so important to our community. And the third way, too, is to think about other ways that we can bring open space and greenery to our neighborhood, whether that's also making Northern Boulevard safer, but also in doing so, making it greener and having more space there. It's thinking about bringing a community center to Jackson Heights as well, where as part of that space, you could also have open areas and access as well. And it's thinking about the ways in which our schools, especially during this pandemic, can capitalize on outdoor space for students and for classes once we reopen. But, the bottom line, I would say, is that we need to really protect and expand our green and open space for our communities that need them. We haven't received that kind of treatment or resources from city government. And now we have the opportunity to do so from Travers Park to 34th Avenue to Northern Boulevard to a community center. And I think that's just so important.
Right. What is the status on 34th Avenue right now? Do you know? I mean, the DOT sort of, as far as I'm aware, hasn't really sort of come up with a firm decision on it. They've pretty much said, yeah, listen, we're behind you guys on 34th Ave. And they're sort of indicating to the electeds there too that they support it. But have they actually come up with a final decision yet? Trying to work that out.
Sure. We need to ensure and hold government accountable to ensure that 34th Avenue is an open and permanent space and designed that way. DOT has definitely indicated that they support the permanence of 34th Avenue, that they will, host community workshops and visioning sessions where we can all participate to ensure that's the case. But I believe from the work that I've done, especially suing the city government over discriminatory rezonings, suing agencies over violating the housing rights of low-income tenants, you can never just take at face value the word of an agency. We really should be the ones leading this process. It's our voices that should be heard. And we need to hold DOT and City Hall accountable for ensuring that the plan and vision that we have for 34th Avenue is the one that's implemented. So there is a process, but it's it's crucial that we play the leading role in ensuring that 34th Avenue becomes the permanent open street that we want it to be.
Okay, terrific, terrific. Moving on to a new topic, zoning and the ULIP process. What are your thoughts on that? Obviously, you're heavily involved with housing, apartments, etc. You probably are very aware of affordability issues across the city. So how would you approach ULIP? And do you like even the whole ULIP system? Would you want that changed, perhaps? So, yeah, give me your thoughts, Shekar.
That's a great question. I have a lot of thoughts on this that we could talk about for a very long time. But I fundamentally believe that housing is a human right and that government must be providing dignified, safe, and permanently affordable housing for everyone, from tenants to those who are homeless, for all in our city. The biggest problem that we face today is that the city's housing policy has been an utter failure. And a crucial reason for that is because, one, the city has embraced relying on private developers to build so-called affordable housing, and that will never work. Two, the city has rezoned neighborhood after neighborhood, in particular low-income communities of color, to build housing that isn't affordable. And they've done so through this process called ULIRP, which fundamentally prioritizes developer dollars and governmental interests to the exclusion of community voices and community input. I think we need to repeal the ULIRP process and completely redesign it so that we have a land use process that actually values community voices and input, and even as part of that, actually takes into account fair housing needs and residential segregation as part of the process. Because as a fair housing lawyer myself, one of my first cases out of law school was representing a 40 organization coalition suing the city of New York over discriminatory rezoning. And it was a 10-year case that we settled with the de Blasio administration, but it revealed the way in which city government does not at all analyze the fair housing needs and the residential segregation in a community before it rezones. That's actually a law under the Fair Housing Act. The city of New York must affirmatively further fair housing. That's not an obligation to avoid segregation. It's actually to affirmatively, as a responsibility, further fair housing when it builds. The ULIRP process in the city does not take into account at all fair housing, housing discrimination, or residential segregation. So what we do need is a process by law that actually takes into account community voices and accounts for fair housing as part of the process. And ULIRP is not that.
I mean, really, at the moment, the only safeguard for communities is the council member and the whole, deference to that council member and the city council on the vote. Are there any other sort of checks and balances that you could sort of see put in place?
Well, I actually think that rezoning and land use decisions have an impact far beyond the community in which it sits. So, for example, I think the Flushing rezoning is a very bad idea and should not happen. That is not just a rezoning that will affect the Flushing waterfront. It will create displacement and gentrification along every neighborhood along the 7 train, including Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. So from that context, one of the biggest problems in the city council has actually been member deference when it comes to rezonings. I know from my fair housing litigation over the Broadway Triangle rezoning that I just mentioned before, that was one of the biggest problems that we saw, where, and I remember sitting in the city council watching us lose the vote because the one council member in whose district that Broadway Triangle rezoning sat voted for the project, despite all of the legal and fair housing concerns that we raised under the Fair Housing Act. And every council member fell in line with that vote, and the rezoning was approved. It was only stopped because we went to court the next day and sued under the Fair Housing Act and actually stopped it. But it shouldn't be that way. And so one of the biggest problems with member deference is that it doesn't really acknowledge the widespread impacts of rezonings across neighborhoods and the way in which rezonings, both as a process with ULIRP, reflects fundamental failures in city policy. So I do think in redoing our ULIRP process and our perspective on rezonings, we can actually, and our perspective on housing, we can actually address these fundamental problems.
But you are opposed to deference, council member deference? it's a tradition or a culture? Do you think it's something that should no longer apply?
I think councilmember deference when it comes to land use and rezoning decisions is very problematic and raises serious fundamental concerns, precisely because it neglects the way in which rezonings have much larger consequences than just one neighborhood. And I think that should not be the case when it comes to land use actions.
All right, terrific. And another topic, immigrants and the rights of immigrants to vote. It's a topic that's becoming, more and more in people's minds. Do you support, immigrants voting that aren't documented or don't have citizenship? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I believe voting rights should be extended to everyone in New York City, regardless of citizenship. And that's an issue that is also very important to me, like housing, of course, because I'm a child of immigrants myself. And in our communities, Jackson Heights and Elmhurst are some of the most diverse, vibrant neighborhoods in the country of immigrant communities from all over. And it's our essential workers, it's our immigrant communities who are our essential workers, who sacrifice so much for the city. And who all of these decisions we're talking about, from housing to schools to policing, affect our immigrant communities directly on the front lines. And I think it's absolutely shocking that despite the way in which how much sacrifices our immigrant neighbors have devoted for this city, and especially during this pandemic, and how much citywide issues affect them, that they don't have a voice, and our communities don't have a voice in the voting process and in decisions made within government itself. And I think that needs to change. And representation only changes when we actually ensure that those who are most affected by our city policies have a voice and a vote in the process. And that begins with our immigrant communities, regardless of citizenship status.
And that includes undocumented as well, is that correct? Yeah.
Correct, yes. Everyone in New York City should have the right to vote.
Okay, excellent. Another topic is the police. Obviously big news with the budget. There was sort of discussion about reducing the budget by $1 billion. Some would say it didn't really get reduced at all. Some said it should be reduced more. But what is your view on the NYPD in terms of funding, in terms of change to the agency?
Community safety really begins with supporting, investing in the neighborhoods, especially low-income communities of color that have been ravaged by policing and state violence for decades. And that is why when we see, we know this, and Jackson Heights and Roosevelt Avenue, for example, had one of the highest stop and frisk rates in the city. But we also saw during the height of the pandemic, the way in which Black lives were devastated and destroyed by state violence, both here with George Floyd, over and over again. One of the fundamental problems that we've approached thinking about protecting communities and keeping communities safe as a law enforcement responsibility. It is actually about investing in the systems and support and resources for the communities that have been over-policed for too long. Our city budget, our council budget that just passed, did nothing to really defund the NYPD and shift resources away to help the communities that have been over-policed for too long. I believe that the NYPD budget should be reduced by at least $1 billion, if not more, and that the resources, and this is the most important part of it, the resources we free up from that council budget, NYPD budget, should be devoted to these same communities that have been over-policed when it comes to housing, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to mental health services, that should really be divorced from law enforcement. I think that's a really important point too, is that so much of our mental health services and resources have been funneled through the police department. And that's just not correct as a matter of policy. We actually need standalone mental health services, response teams, and resources for our communities. And so I believe that really investing in neighborhoods and in communities of color that have been policed for so long is frankly the best way to help and also ensure communities stay safe. And it's not through more law enforcement.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. One issue actually that's going to come up, and you would see it more than anyone, when the eviction moratorium ends at the end of the year. I mean, what are we going to see, and what can be done to what could be sort of like an avalanche of pain out there? What are your thoughts on that?
This is one of the most urgent issues facing New York State right now. And it's something that my colleagues and I have worked on for months now. The eviction moratorium in place has not been a real moratorium. Governor Cuomo has rolled it back as time has gone on. The housing courts have pushed forward with eviction cases. But the biggest crisis is without any relief from the state government, tenants simply cannot pay rent. And so you're just snowballing the amount of money that many tenants are going to owe. And as you mentioned yourself, Christian, open the doors to a cascade of eviction cases when the courts fully reopen, as they are starting to do now anyway. There's actually legislation in New York State right now that both Senator Julia Salazar as well as Assemblywoman Yulian New have sponsored that would cancel rent for tenants and mortgages for small homeowners. This is the kind of relief that we need, because we have to be honest that many tenants simply are forced to choose between paying rent or putting food on the table for their families right now. That is an impossible choice to make. And so until government actually steps up to the plate with real relief for tenants, these kinds of moratoriums and court orders are just stopgap measures that are not going to solve the problem. And in fact, they're allowing the problem to fester when it's going to create an avalanche down the line.
And that's going to be big in the 25th Council District, do you think?
Absolutely. We are a community that is overwhelmingly a community of renters. And there are so many tenants, especially immigrant tenants, who are so vulnerable, who right now are simply unable to pay their rent. And I think, it's something that, especially as housing becomes more and more unaffordable in the city, with rezoning after rezoning, with harassment of tenants by landlords, the amount of pressure placed on tenants in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst is going to get even greater.
Okay. All right. Now, on a different topic, we're bouncing around. Transportation in Western Queens. There's a lot can be done. Obviously, right now, not too many people are taking the train like they used to, but with a bit of lady luck, that'll change in the next 6 months. So what would you be doing to try and increase transportation options for, residents of the 25th Council District?
We have to make our transportation systems, from subways to buses to streets, far more accessible and far more connected. I mean, public transportation is the most critical service in our city. And, one of the biggest problems that we face is really on every level. Our trains and our train stations are not accessible for seniors, for parents with strollers and with young children. And I've seen that many times too in going to our subway stations. Our streets are so dangerous for children and seniors. Northern Boulevard is now labeled the new Boulevard of Death because of how dangerous it is and how many child fatalities there have been there over the years, and how much advocacy that groups like Make Queens Safer have done on the ground. On top of that, we have so many unprotected bike lanes in Western Queens, which have resulted in fatalities and injuries as well, and bike dead ends where they don't connect to actually different neighborhoods. And as a biker myself, I've seen that too when I've taken my bike out with my 5-year-old as well. And on top of that, we just have bus service where there's so much congestion on the streets. We don't have express bus lanes. Northern Boulevard is totally backed up when it comes to bus service. And earlier this year, you think about those issues, the MTA was actually thinking about cutting back bus service in Western Queens rather than expanding it. We have neighborhoods like East Elmhurst that are transit deserts completely when it comes to public transportation, especially when it comes to trains. So what we really need to do is, in all of those ways, do far more to connect the neighborhoods of Western Queens. Prioritize express busways and bus service for Northern Boulevard. Make sure that our subway stations are fully accessible for individuals with disabilities, with seniors, and for children. To make sure that our bike lanes are actually protected and they're interconnected. And they connect between neighborhoods as well as parks in different neighborhoods too. But on all of these fronts, we need to be doing far more to actually make our neighborhoods connected when it comes to transportation and public transit. And we haven't really, that's been a huge deficiency in our neighborhoods too.
All right, terrific. Now, you've got a couple of kids, and I want to talk to you about public education.
Sure.
School seats in this district, well, I think it might be the most overcrowded, or in the top 2 or 3 most overcrowded districts in terms of seats. What are your thoughts, and what can be done to alleviate that problem?
We have to be investing far more resources, dollars, and services in our public schools. Our public schools and our local neighborhood schools are excellent and the crucial institutions in our neighborhood. But unfortunately, they're missing so much in terms of state and city aid that they were owed under the foundation aid, under litigation, that was resources that were promised to them by court order that our schools haven't gotten, despite having court-ordered a settlement that mandated such resources. On top of that, we are, as you mentioned, Christian, we have some of the highest rates of overcrowding in our schools. And it's really, and we also have schools across our city and here as well that are deeply segregated. So we're ensuring that the resources that our neighborhood schools are owed under state law, under court order, are actually given to our schools. By doing that, we can make sure that we can reduce class sizes, and by reducing class sizes, we can actually, significantly address the problem of overcrowding, and that we can also ensure that with more resources, we're actually addressing the aging infrastructure and equipment within our schools that can actually help us expand our schools and also provide more open space and also classroom space for our students. Right. I think all of those things in different ways will help alleviate the problem of overcrowding that we've seen in our district. That's a really serious issue, and it really begins with investing far more resources in our neighborhood public schools.
Okay, all right. On one of the last sort of topics I'm going to bring up, community boards. How would you go about appointing new members, and what do you think of community boards in general? Do you think they should be merely advisory? Would you think they should have binding votes? So what are your thoughts on both of those issues pertaining to community boards?
Sure. I just want to mention one more point, is going back also, Kristen, to your question on the schools too, is of course recognizing that we're in, the middle of a pandemic and a second wave right now too. It's critical that our schools also receive the resources to ensure that every single student has the technology at home for remote learning, and especially that multilingual learners, students with disabilities, students who are homeless are prioritized first when it comes to methods of education. So I think there's the larger plan of what we do with our schools themselves and our public schools and investing far more in them, but also more immediately, what are we doing to actually help students learn in a remote learning environment during a pandemic? And I think taking a public health approach to education is so important there too. And to your point about the community boards, the community boards are really one of the most basic and fundamental ways to participate in local government, in local democracy, and our local communities too. We have to make sure that our community is diverse, our community boards are as diverse and representative as possible in every way, from race to gender to class to geography. The problem we have right now is that the processes by which community boards appointments are made are not as transparent as possible and not as accessible as possible, both in terms of who's able to, who even knows the process to apply for community boards, and then actually, participating in that process itself. On top of that, community board meetings can also be inaccessible to many members in our neighborhoods who may not be aware of when the meetings are happening, where they are, and how to travel to those meetings too. So what we really need to be doing is coming up with a process and improving the process for community board appointments to make sure that everyone who's interested in participating is able to have the opportunity to do so. That those who are least likely to apply and least likely to know about the application process are aware of ways to apply for community boards. That's the only way to get representative community boards. And on top of that, we need to make sure that the meetings and the processes to participate in those meetings are as accessible as possible to neighborhood residents.
All right, terrific. Shekar, thank you very much for joining me today, and best wishes in your campaign.
Thank you, Christian. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me and looking forward to connecting in the future too.